I'm Loretta Hayes from Hayes Sewing Machine Company in Wilmington, Delaware. And welcome back to our creative videos. Today we're going to do a little different video than our normal runs. We're at the beginning of 2024. And while I don't really do New Year's resolutions anymore, I definitely do goals for the year. And one of my goals might be one of your goals, and that is to tame my stash. Now, I am not talking about getting rid of my stash. I'm not talking about making it so that I have no more fabric. I'm only going to have fabric for the projects that I'm working on. However, my stash has gotten a little unwieldy. And so if yours has as well, for me, 2024, my goal is to, throughout the year, kind of minimize my stash a little bit. Get those pieces out that really aren't going to be, they're too big to throw away, but they're not big enough to actually do something with. So I wanted to show you my approach to doing that. So I find that if I start out with a pattern, so I pick out a pattern and I'm like, I am going to use fabric out of my stash to make this pattern. What happens to me is I get my pattern out and I start pulling fabrics out from my stash, and then I'm like, oh, well, that's pretty. Oh, well, maybe I should sort this out. Oh, maybe let me refold that fabric. And I get very little done on my actual stash. I might actually get that one quilt done, but I don't really make any impact on my stash. So I've approached this year a little differently. And so what I've done is I have set up where I am going to do different shapes out of my stash throughout the year. So my first grouping is based off of a 5-inch square. And the reason why I chose a 5-inch square would be equivalent to a charm pack. And so there are many patterns out there that have 5-inch squares in them. And so I thought, okay, well then I'll be able to get different patterns. So what I did is I rated my stash, and I took a look, and when I look at my stash is a little larger maybe than yours. The big thing is like, oh, what color should I do? What, should I do some of this, some of that? And so how I started it out is I picked a color family. Now for me, that is green. I love every shade of green. I like lime green. I like chartreuse green. I like moss green. I like forest green. I like blue green. I like teal. You name it, I've got it in my green. And so my green is the largest color family in my stash. So it made sense to start there. So what I did is I rated my stash and I started picking out fabrics. And I wasn't after the big hunk of fabrics. I was after these kinds of fabrics. So like this fabric here, too big to throw away. But realistically, if I'm cutting for a quilt, I don't have nearly enough fabric to work with on that. And then I had this one here, which I'm pretty sure was the backing off of a quilt. Just that strip that you cut off the edge when you're done. But once again, too big for doing the quilt. So I literally I grabbed a bunch of fabric out of my greens and I separated them so that I had larger pieces off to the side, and then I had all of these kind of weird pieces. And then I proceeded to cut out 5-inch squares. I didn't organize them, I just cut them out. If anything, I just left them in piles so that like all the lime greens were together, all the blue greens were together, that kind of thing. So once I got the 5-inch squares done, then I started looking for patterns. And what I found was that if I did Villa Rosa patterns, which are the patterns that come on the postcards, they are, honestly, if you can put the cutting directions and the piecing directions on the back of a postcard, they can't get any easier than that. And that's what I wanted to take care of these blocks. So I found 3 patterns that I found really interesting to do. One of them only uses the 5-inch squares, so that's all that I needed. The other 2, I used the 5-inch squares, and then I had some background fabric that I worked with. And so I actually rated that from my stash as well. So the first one, let's do the first one here, Pam. Can you pan down? Or maybe I'll just hold it up.
That's fine.
So this one is Petite 4s. That's what the pattern looks like. It has 5-inch squares in the center, and then it has 2 backgrounds. And so on the backgrounds, you need a yard each. So what I did is I rated my stash, and I found where I had something a yard each. Now, what was interesting on my backgrounds, I had a yard of the blue batik. The gray was the leftover backing from another project. So it was one of those 108 things. And so I had what was roughly equivalent to a yard of fabric. So I'm like, yay, I can do that. So those became my neutrals. And then I took my green squares and I started laying them out. So I thought to make a scrap quilt that had a little bit of structure, I thought, let me break it into warms and cools. So if you take a look on this, we have 3 rows that have kind of warm greens, lime greens, chartreuse greens, even this kind of what I call spring green. And then I have 3 rows that have definitely got blue greens in it. So blue, kind of teal batiks, prints, solids, all of that kind of thing. So I divided it up into 2 and then proceeded to start piecing. And this block is incredibly easy. It is a center square. It's got a skinnier strip at the top and a bigger strip on the bottom. And so what happens, you go ahead and sew those strips on, and then you take it, and the next one, you flip the block over so the skinny strip is at the bottom. And that's what gives that kind of undulation, so it doesn't just look like ladders going across the top of the quilt. I love this quilt because it was interesting. It was fast to piece. I literally pieced it in an evening on there. So that is my first quilt, my first recommendation if you're planning on taking and taming your stash. Now, what's fun about this is on the back, this backing piece was left over from another project. And if we look really close, we'll find a seam. There it is. There it is right there. So I had backing cut from one end of it and of quilt and backing on the other. And so literally I just sewed the 2 of them together, created enough fabric to do my backing, and then out of my stash of fabric, I had something that I thought would work for the binding. So this quilt literally came entirely from my stash. So that is quilt number 1. It's called Petite 4s from Villa Rosa. All right, so next quilt, because here's my problem. If I'm doing a bunch of quilts, if I don't do something that's a little different, I'll get bored. I get bored really easily. And so then I'll stop. And so I still had all these squares cut out, so I needed to do those. So I wanted to come in and I wanted to do my next one, which is called Cascade. And Cascade uses 35 5-inch squares if you do it the way the pattern does. And it has a background strip. And so your block, when you're doing your block, will look like this. So it'll have a block like that. And literally what happens is the block goes, you'll flip it like this, you'll flip it like this. The layout's on the back of the pattern, but it's just one block and you're just repeating the same thing. Now, for the background on this one, you needed 1.5 yards. Well, I didn't have a white on white print that I had a yard and a half of. I had this one here that I had about a yard of. The background also does the border on the pattern. So the background here and the border here are supposedly the same fabric. So I hit this when I'm working entirely out of my stash. You never have exactly what you need. So what I decided to do is I decided to cut strips for the blocks out of that yard of fabric. So I ended up with a quilt that was larger than what was on the pattern. I just kept adding to the rows and made a few extra rows to it. But I cut everything that I had in that one fabric. Now, one of the things that I love about the Cascade pattern is it is like the blocks are floating. And so I was like, oh, I really would like to have that. So what I did is I raided my stash and I found another white on white print that I had about a quarter of a yard of. So I cut strips that were roughly 1.5 inches. And so I cut those around and made a small frame. Now the border for this one, they recommend 3 inches. So I didn't have that amount of fabric, so I cut what I had. And so then I went in and I raided those bigger pieces of green fabric. And so I had some of this fabric here for my quilt border. So I went ahead and I chopped that up and that gave me my quilt border. So once again, entirely out of my stash. So this quilt here is bigger. Let's see if we can get it the right way, Pam. Maybe we'll swing it around this way. Can you get it?
Yep, that's pretty. So kind of her to make that for me, isn't it?
Yeah, you can have it if you want. All right. So this one here, entirely out of my stash again. But once again, a little bit adapted because of the yardage that I had. The backing on the back, once again, out of the stash. It was a white on white print that was marked. So I cut the mark out and then re-pieced the backing. And that became my backing for there. And then even the binding, guys, came out of the greens.
Woohoo.
So that's the advantage of separating it, those bigger pieces from the weird smaller pieces, because you'll use those bigger pieces for your backing, for your binding, for your borders. That quilt did not have, on the pattern, did not have a green border around. But remember, I only had that little white border, so I wanted to give it a little bit more of an anchor. So that is inspiration number 2. That is Cascade. Still using those same 5-inch squares that I cut out originally. Now our last one, the last one is the most exciting one to me because it only used the 5-inch squares. So I started out, this is called Mod Tiles 2. And so I started out with this one here. And this one is made exactly like the pattern, except I added a green border to it. So we have that. And what's fun about this
So this is the charm.
That's your
and then
your
this
5
obviously where you cut
is
it.
just cut in half.
Cool.
And the way that it lays out, you have essentially 2 rectangular blocks that are slightly different. The squares are sewn together on one, and then the ends go here, and then on the second one they're going into the center, and you reverse them.
Got it.
But super, super cool.
That's pretty.
So we got that done. Had a little bit of muslin, so we did the muslin backing, and then once again our binding on there. So once again, we're really kind of moving along. Now, I got those 3 quilts done, and I had gotten really, really gung-ho on cutting the 5-inch squares.
Hence, quilt number 4.
So hence, quilt number 4. And so this quilt was all of the leftover green squares.
Wow.
I had like I don't know. I had like maybe 4 or 5 different ones that wouldn't have made an entire row.
Sure.
But I literally just kept piecing until I was finished. And so this was super fun. So this one has, kind of the warm color greens and also the blue color, the cool color greens. And so when I was laying it out on the floor, I just kind of laid it out. I made the blocks first and then just rearranged the blocks. I didn't lay out all the individual blocks. That would take way too much time. But this is how big it's going to be. And so we will get a backing appropriately to that. I don't actually think I have a backing. This is going to be the first one that I actually need to get a backing to.
Got it.
So this is Mod Tiles 2 from the Villa Rosa pattern line. And Fabulous doesn't need a background fabric. It literally is just from the 5-inch squares.
Got it.
So I no longer have any 5-inch squares from my original cut. And I could go back and pick another color way and start doing other quilts, the same quilts in just a different color. So maybe purples and blues or that kind of thing. But I think what I'll do is for my next grouping of quilts, I think I'm going to change my shape. So these were 5-inch squares. I think my next ones are going to be 2.5-inch strips. So a little later on the year, you're going to see a bunch of quilts that I've done with 2.5-inch strips. Now, one last thing. When I was doing my stash, what I also found is I had a whole bunch of weird pieces of batting. And oftentimes I use those weird pieces of batting for like practicing free motion patterns or that kind of thing. But man, I had a lot of them. Way more than I'm going to need to practice free motion patterns. So what I thought I'd do is I thought I would Frankenstein some battings together. So all of the battings that were in the quilts are all Frankenstein batting.
But it's all the same type of batting. It's like warm and natural or warm and white.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
So you don't want to do like a craft bat and something
No,
else.
no. You want to keep the weight the same.
Got it.
And if you haven't Frankenstein batting, the big thing on Frankensteining batting is that you want to cut the edge of the batting so it's straight. So we have something that we can butt together. So once you have got pieces together, then you're going to come in on your sewing machine. We're going to set up a zigzag and we're going to go as wide as we possibly can. And we're going to go about, I usually run it about 3 in stitch length. We don't want to have a ton of stitches. We just want it to hold together until we can get it into the quilt. I use my walking foot and I'm literally going to just butt the 2 of them together. We don't want them to overlap. Otherwise we'll get a ridge in our quilt when we quilt it. And so literally we'll take off and we'll just take and stitch. And so I took pieces that were similar sized, cut a straight edge, Frankensteined it together, rotary cut a straight edge, added my next piece to it, and just built my piece of batting until I ran out of pieces of bat. And tell you, when you do batting out of your stash goes down way faster. Yeah, because I mean, literally, I had 2, maybe leaning towards 3 big bags of batting. Not trash bag style, but like big shopping bags going along on there. So another thing that you can use to tame your stash. So I hope this inspires you. Super fun to do. I've enjoyed it. I've made these 4 quilt tops and 3 completed ones done. I'm going to say in a month's time.
Show off.
Once I got cut out, and that's the key to it, I didn't do any organizing when I was cutting out. I just took the pieces and cut 5-inch squares, and then I went ahead and organized it. Then I didn't get the trap of trying to organize my stash as I go. And I figure once I've got a bunch of fabrics out, all these kind of small messy pieces, I will actually go back and reorganize my stash. But that may be later on this year. So I hope I inspired you to try to use some of those weird pieces out of your stash, and we'll see you next time.